Our district superintendent, Don Harder, is here. And for those of you who don't know, I don't know if there's anyone like that here, but our church is a member of the Evangelical Free Church of Canada. And the Evangelical Free Church is divided into districts, and we're part of the Alberta Parkland District. And Don Harder and his wife Shirley visit all the churches around our district. And he's going to tell us a little bit about that, I think, but mostly I've invited him to speak on 1 Kings. He said we were together at some E-Free Church meetings, and he said, well, I haven't been at your church for a while. And that's good, because very often when Don visits churches, it's because they're looking for a pastor, or they're having a conflict, or they need some help of some kind, and so it's much nicer to visit when everything's going well. And so I said, well, Don, if you want to come to our church, you got to pick a book of the Bible, because we're going through the Bible. He picked 1 Kings, so that's why he's here this Sunday. So he's a good friend of ours, a good support in our ministry. Don, would you come and share what God's laid on your heart?
Well, thanks, Pastor Marvin. I love always coming and following Marvin's ministry, because he's always got unique things he's doing. And so when I asked to come, he said, well, yeah, you can do it provided you fit into this little box here of what I am trying to do. So it'll be a challenge, but fortunately, there's also a 2 Kings. So if I get 1 Kings wrong, he'll be able to correct it in 2 Kings. Because in the Jewish Bible, they're actually together as one book, just 2 scrolls. Anyways, I want to give just a very brief update of what's happening district-wise. Some of you maybe have heard we've added another what we call associate church in Eckville. We had a group of about 40 people, 45 people there that were meeting, had been an Alliance satellite group kind of thing out of Sylvan Lake. And then were cut loose after 7 years. They had no structure or anything. And so they didn't know what to do. Well, Ron Swanson, who used to be president of the Free Church, was asked to speak a couple of times, and you can't be under him too often before you soon feel pulled to the Free Church. So next thing, I was being called in, and so they've agreed they want to come in. They're not a church at all. They have no legal status whatsoever. I said, you got to get that in place first, but we'll help you. In the meantime, we'll take you on as an associate church plant. So we've got a group there, and it's going gangbusters. We've got Ron Swanson and Grant Sixstrom from the missionary church, Evangelical Missionary Church, co-pastoring half-time. So they're putting it all together, and it's an exciting group. They're energized, and they want to reach Eckville for Jesus Christ. So we're excited about that. Now, the other thing you've been looking at supporting is Wembley. And I want to thank you for giving consideration to that. You saw the picture of Dwight and Sherry Munn, the pastoral couple there. They started 18 months ago, and they had usage of a building that had become reverted back to their mother church at McLaurin Baptist. And the church said, you know, we have too much history. We don't think we're the ones that can replant here. Would you consider doing that? Because we do want it to be a church. So we have the building for $250 a month. We had to put a $20,000 deposit on it, but it was assessed recently. The fair rental value is actually about $35,000 to $4,000 a month. So we've got a bargain. So we have a 2-year lease, and that's coming up due in 6 months. So we've got to figure out what we do with this. They really want to sell the building. They'd like us to purchase it. As a district, we don't have the funds to do that, and neither do they as a young church plant. So it's gone a little slower than we hoped, There was a lot of negative baggage tied to that church at the end of its 30 years as a Baptist work, but it is going forward. I was there in early January, and I walked in the doors, and you know what met me? A whole raft of kids running around the foyer, and the foyer is quite a bit bigger than yours. It's almost as big as this whole area, and they have play centers. And the kids are just running around having a great time. I met a couple of new moms that were bringing their kids for the first time. They were going, shh, you're going to church. You have to be quiet. Can you imagine what those kids felt when they came in those doors and said, but it's a play center. So good things happening there. They're having a good ministry, but it is slower than we thought. And so they will need support a little longer than we anticipated. So we're at this, the Chinese have this symbol that means crisis and opportunity. And that's where we are with the building there. Trying to come up with some kind of a plan that hopefully we can retain the use of that building because it's pretty essential to the church plant work there. So pray with us on that. And also continue to support Dwight and Sherry Munn. I looked at the latest stats. They're about $6,000 short on their budget for this year. So they do need some help. Anyways, that's just a brief update. District-wise, we appreciate your ongoing support for our district. Now, to get to 1 Kings. I always love coming here because what I remember is that every time I come here, I've got a biblical challenge to do. I remember coming here and teaching on Proverbs. How do you take Proverbs and break it into teachable segments? I love doing it. I don't get to do Bible teaching much as a superintendent. It's generally trying to generate just a motivation, inspiration for our churches. And so Marvin gave me this to do, and I'm looking forward to doing it. And I just have loved getting into 1 Kings. If you want to turn in your Bibles, turn into 1 Kings chapter 7. I won't read it right away, but I will start with this illustration. 2 weeks ago, if you've watched the news, you will recall that the great cathedral in Paris, Notre Dame, was ravaged by fire. And the roof and the spires of this, the spire of this cathedral, and the nave, which is the common people's area, like your sanctuary, was mostly burnt, destroyed. What was left, interestingly enough, and which they were so glad to be able to save, was, of course, right the front, the narthex, the place of the worship table center in the Catholic Church, the Mass, and the organ, and they were able to save the 2 towers at the front, which is interesting to me. It kind of said, wow, that's symbolic, I think. The restoration for this building was very quickly committed to, and it seems like the attempt will be to complete it within 5 years. Whether they'll succeed, I don't know. It took 200 years to build it. But it reminded me, though, that what's going to be the hard part is to rebuild the faith of the community that was meant to worship in it. Because although a majority of France would claim Catholic faith, only 5% are actually practicing believers. So it's largely symbolic. to have this great big building in Paris. In fact, most of the people that attend there would be tourists rather than actually practicing Catholics from Paris. And so to me it was interesting that what was actually gutted was the nave, the place of the people. Isn't that interesting? That was the part that really got burnt and destroyed. And I think God maybe was saying something. We aren't used to looking at things spiritually as symbolically, but I think God still speaks that way. What was interesting to me was that these two towers remained largely unscathed. And it reminded me of a subtle, but I think a critical story in 1 Kings chapter 7, starting at verse 13. So follow in your Bibles, and then we'll go from there. 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 13. Now King Solomon sent and brought Hiram from Tyre. He was a widow's son from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in bronze. He was filled with wisdom and understanding and skill for doing any work in bronze. So he came to King Solomon and performed all his work. He fashioned 2 pillars of bronze. 18 cubits was the height of one, and a line of 12 cubits measured the circumference of both. He also made 2 capitals of molten bronze to set on top of the pillars. The height of the one capital was 5 cubits, and the height of the other was 5 cubits. There were nets of network and twisted threads of chainwork for the capitals which were on top of the pillars, 7 for the one and 7 for the other. So he made the pillars and 2 rows around on one network to cover the capitals which were on the top of the capitals, on the pomegranates, and so he did for the other capital. The capitals which were on the top of the pillars in the porch were of lily design 4 cubits. There were capitals on the 2 pillars, even above and close to the rounded projection, which was beside the network, and the pomegranates numbered 200 in rows around both capitals. Thus he set up the pillars at the porch of the nave, so at the entryway. And he set up the right pillar and named it Jachin, and he set up the left pillar and named it Boaz. And on the top of the pillars was lily design, so the work of the pillars was finished. Now you may wonder, what's the significance of that, and how are you going to draw all 1 Kings into that story? Boaz means God establishes. And when a name was engraved at the entryway on a pillar, it generally meant this is the architect. This is the designer. This is the builder. And so the one pillar was saying, God is the architect here. This was not just human thinking. God had a plan. The second pillar, Jachin, meant God establishes, or God is foundational to being established. So God designed, and if it's going to continue, you got to keep looking there. Interesting, isn't it? This is what was required to endure. So I have no idea what the 2 towers of Notre Dame were meant to actually be, what their functional purpose was, other than one holds the bells. The other has a staircase and you can climb up and overlook Paris. But it's interesting that they had these 2 towers as well. And maybe representative, maybe taken out of this story. And they're the ones left standing. As though God is saying once again, I'm the architect, and if you want to keep going, you got to keep looking here. I don't know. But they imitate the two pillars at the temple entry, that God is the architect and he alone is foundational to endurance. Now let's look at the whole of the book of 1 Kings, and actually 2 Kings in a way as well, because they, as I say in Hebrew scriptures, the two are tied as one book. And I said to the worship team, if I don't get it right, Pastor Marvin will correct when he does 2 Kings. And I trust him to do that. The authorship of this book is unknown, in the sense that it's not given. But most people speculate that it was written by Jeremiah. Now, the book of Kings is not just a historical book. In the Hebrew scriptures, they are called the former prophets. So they actually are seen as prophetic books that have a message to God's people. The writer of this book, we know, has very strong ties to the book of Deuteronomy and refers back to Deuteronomy numerous times in the things that are mentioned in the book. For example, that kings should not have many wives, or that they shouldn't take and accumulate a lot of horses, or that they need to follow the Lord with a whole heart and obey all his statutes. Moses mentioned all those things as he passed on the leadership to Joshua. And he did that in the book of Deuteronomy. So the writer of this book talks continually of the fealty, and by that we mean the loyal duty that Israel was supposed to have back to God, to Jehovah. And this book carries a message as a result, which is much more than just a record of the kings and of God's dealings with mankind, but it's much more that they are led by kings, but they are to remember there is a king above their kings. Now, why do we say Jeremiah probably wrote this? Well, Jeremiah, you remember, also wrote Lamentations. How does Lamentations begin? Very first verse. How desolate lies the city that once was full of people. She has become like a widow. And then he goes on to describe the desolation of Jerusalem when it is totally destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And the temple is all torn down, and nothing is left standing, not a stone upon stone, it says. It seems like Jeremiah had a front row seat to that destruction. We also know that he wrote through Seraiah the scribe to the people in Babylon. Jeremiah 51, verse 59. He instructs Seraiah to send a letter to Babylon. So he's in contact with the people who are there. He also is involved with the people left in Jerusalem. And it seems like 1 Kings is a very natural book for him to have written to answer the question of those in Babylon and those left in Jerusalem. How did we get here? How did we get here in this mess, in this pile of rubble, in this destruction, in this strange foreign country? How did we get here? Well, how did we get here? 1 Kings begins with great beginnings. David had been king over the 12 tribes, And he was king for 40 years, following Saul, who also had been king for 40 years. Saul had been the people's king, but hadn't been God's king. But God said, I myself, he said to Samuel, will find a king. And he found David. And David became king for 40 years. It says that David followed God with a full heart. 1 Kings 11, verse 6. He followed God with a full heart. Doesn't mean he was perfect. Doesn't mean he was sinless. No, we know his sins, his faults. His sin with Bathsheba, his murder of Uriah, the general. We know his faults. But he had a full heart in the sense that he was humble, and when he was challenged by the prophet with his sins, he immediately repented. And he corrected his course. So David set the bar spiritually as a king. And so God had come to David already and said to David, because you have followed me with a full heart, you will not lack a son to sit on the throne. That's exactly what Moses said, right? If you're going to take and obey these commands, God's going to establish you. That second pillar, right? God's going to establish you. So Solomon now, in the beginning of Kings, becomes the king, the heir. If David is a conqueror, Solomon is a builder. If David is a commander, Solomon is a diplomat. Part of that diplomacy was to have many, many wives. It's the way you often cemented your diplomatic ties, by exchanging and marrying into the family, so to speak. It's no different than used to happen in Europe. Many of the monarchies actually are all interrelated in Europe. Solomon has a similar humility of his father initially. And we know that from the story in 1 Kings chapter 3, where God appears to Solomon and says, ask what you wish, and I'll give it to you. And Solomon thinks, and then he says, who am I to lead these people? I don't know. I'm just a child. But give me wisdom so I can lead these people. And God does. And God says a lot more. He says, not only will I give you wisdom, but because you didn't ask things for yourself, but rather for the benefit of the people, I'm going to bless you with a lot more. I'm going to give you riches and fame and all the things that people aspire to. And so his rule is consolidated. 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 46 says, thus the kingdom was established in the hands of Solomon. It's all consolidated. So he doesn't have to go out. Solomon, as far as we know, we don't ever hear of him even having to go and fight a war. Interesting. His dad had to fight lots of them. Solomon doesn't have to. His rule is established. It's solid. And it says in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 3, now Solomon loved the Lord, and he walked in the statutes of his father David. That's the beginning. Solomon saying, I love God, I'm going to obey, I'm going to be like my dad. My dad set a good example. And he has a hankering to do something. And he says, I'm going to build. I'm going to build a temple for my God. And I'm going to build the palace court and a big palace. So he sets his heart into building. And he builds a temple, and he builds the palace, and he builds cities, and he builds garrisons, and he gets and acquires more horses, and he starts doing the things God said you're not supposed to do, right? Don't be a king that acquires many horses. Now you've had 40 years of David, a man after God's own heart, to the very time in 1 Kings chapter 9, you have another dream. I call it the halftime dream. 20 years later, for 20 years, Solomon has followed God fully. He's loving the Lord. But then after the consecration of the temple and moving into the palace, God comes with another dream and says, it's very much a repetition. Solomon, remember, it's all based on whether or not you're going to follow me with a full heart. We know a lot about halftime, right? We talk about men with midlife crises. All of a sudden, somebody goes out and buys a nice bright red sports car. Or all of a sudden, divorces his wife and finds a trophy wife. We know about this. We talk about it. And it seems God is saying, Solomon, you've had success everywhere. The success we hear about is actually in the story of the Queen of Sheba coming. She's trying to investigate, is this all true? Can this be true that somebody can be such an amazing person, such a great king, so wise, so successful? And she comes and she investigates and says, not even the half has been told. Your fame has spread, the gold is plentiful, silver is literally valueless. It says in chapter 10, verse 23. I kind of wonder whether it's at this time that Solomon writes Ecclesiastes. Vanity of vanities. So what is Ecclesiastes about? All the things I set my heart on to pursue, and it never really satisfied. But then we get to 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 1 to 4. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women along with the daughter of Pharaoh. That was his first wife. Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, Hittite. From the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. Yet Solomon held fast to these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. I think this is why you have the halftime dream. Somewhere God sensed something already. Success has hit Solomon. He's starting to believe his own press reports. And he's got this one little thing that's a distraction. All these beautiful women. And God says, I told you. Don't accumulate many wives as a king. That's as serious as accumulating too many horses. I don't know how many horses are too much. I don't know how many wives are too much. I know that he probably had 999 too much. And it says he did not follow the Lord fully. Now here's the turning point. Verse 9 of chapter 11. Now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, who had appeared to him twice. Twice. You see, when God appeared to David, it only took once. And David repented. It's twice. And so God comes to him and says, I'm angry with you. I am angry with you to such a point, verse 13 of that chapter, I will tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Pardon me, verse 12. God tears the kingdom from Solomon. Take note of that. It's God. It's not another king, although God used other kings. But God says, I myself become your opponent to tear the kingdom from you, Solomon. But it won't be in your lifetime. So Solomon dies. Rehoboam, his son, becomes king. And what happens? The seeds of division had already been planted in Solomon's reign. His building acumen and desire, in the midst of that, he had conscripted 180,000 workers out of Israel, sent them off to work wherever he was building. And it wasn't because he hired them, he conscripted them. And so when Rehoboam becomes the king, they come to him and said, your father made it really difficult for us. And we're going to serve you if you'll make it a little easier. But he unfortunately has fools for advisors. And he comes back to them and he says in chapter 12, verse 11, your father made our yoke heavy. Now you make it lighter for us. But you shall speak to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Whereas my father loaded you with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. And guess what happens? 10 tribes say, we're done. Now it seems like it's Rehoboam who tore the kingdom. But God said, I will tear the kingdom from you. God already is using something that people have been festering on in their minds during the whole time of Solomon's reign. We hate this conscription. I know he's built all kinds of marvelous things, and they're beautiful to look at and all the rest, and it's great for tourists that come here from all over the world, but we're tired of this. This is a heavy load. And Rehoboam refuses to listen. And so David, who had consolidated the kingdom within 40 years, it's split, torn in two. And the rest of Kings actually is a story now of attempts to consolidate again, but always derailed as people slipped further into the idolatry that Solomon introduced. Until Elijah actually appears at the end of 1 Kings to pronounce God's judgment to King Ahab, who's the last king in 1 Kings. And Ahab thinks that, well, he's got quite a queen, Jezebel, that somehow God can't be taken too seriously. And they're going to somehow patch this all up again. So he goes with Jehoshaphat, who's the northern or the southern king, and he's the northern king, and we'll go to battle against Aram together, and we'll be partners once again. And we'll get this thing all functioning again the way it ought to. And so they go into battle together. Ahab says, I'm going to disguise myself, because really the battle is between Aram and I, and so I'm going to kind of hide here in the military. But you go out there, and Ahab's disguised, but it says that he is shot at random. 1 Kings 22, verse 34. A random arrow, a chance arrow, it says. And from there it just goes downhill to where Israel is scattered among the nations. In 150 years, they're gone. 300 years later, Judah is gone. Because God said, I will tear the kingdom from you. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how many kings you have. It doesn't matter how many come and say, we somehow want to repair this. It's not going to work. Now let's get back to these twin pillars. Jashan and Boaz. God had said, I'm the architect. Boaz. I set up, but I also establish. I sustain. And God had said to Solomon, 1 Kings 9:3, my eyes will be on those pillars perpetually. You may forget those things, but I'm going to watch them all the time. I will never forget those pillars. The last sight that Jeremiah has, in Jeremiah, last chapter, 52, is fascinating. Jeremiah 52, verse 12 and 13. It says, on the 10th day of the 5th month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the bodyguard who was in the service of the king, came to Jerusalem. He burned the house of the Lord, the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Even every large house he burned with fire. The captain of the guard carried away into exile some of the poorest of the people, the rest of the people who were left in the city, and the deserters who had deserted to the king of Babylon and to the rest of the artisans. But Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left some of the poorest of the people in the land to be vine dressers and plowmen. So that's the destruction of Jerusalem 300 years later. Now here's this little phrase. Now the bronze pillars which belong to the house of the Lord, and the stands and the bronze sea which were just outside of the house of the Lord, the Chaldeans broke in pieces and carried all their bronze to Babylon. One of the last sites Jeremiah records of Jerusalem. is the Babylonians taking those two pillars. God said, my eyes will always be on these two. I'm going to remember, I establish. I'm the architect. You follow my rules or you break them at your peril. And he sees the Babylonians carting off these two pillars into Babylon. Notre Dame still has its twin towers. It's interesting, though, Notre Dame, or France, pardon me, is declared to be a completely secular state. They want it that way. I wonder why God left those twin towers standing. I don't know whether there's a message there. But I know there's a message here for us, because in a way those towers still stand. God says, I'm the one who establishes. I've made the rules. I'm the architect. I have the plan. You follow it, or you break it at your peril. What are we building? We're not building anything like that. But we are building marriages. We're building homes. Maybe we're building a business. We're building a church, I hope. We're building a province. We're building a country. We need to be mindful of the pillars. Amen. God bless you. It's been a joy to be here.